Who were the most ruthless businessmen in history? What are examples of their ruthlessness? During South Korea's economic boom in the 1980s, Sampong was erected in Seoul. Originally planned to be an apartment complex, a new boss by the name of Lee Jun decided midway that he wanted it to become a shopping center instead. This required changes to the plans, most notably the removal of several support columns so that escalators could be installed. Due to serious constructional concerns, the construction company refused to carry out these changes, leading Lee to fire them and bringing in his own builders. His further demands meant there were other issues with the completed building too. There was no steel skeleton or crossbeams, which meant that load couldn't be transferred across floors. He also ordered the floor columns to be reduced to below the safe thickness, to maximize floor space, and had them spread further out, increasing the load on each, for the same reason. 3 air conditioning units weighing 15 tons each were installed on the roof, exceeding the load capacity by 4 times. Cracks in the building started to appear just a few short years after opening, after the air conditioning units were dragged across the roof, causing cracks. By April 1995, more cracks were beginning to appear on the 5th floor too. Lee and the management's only response was to move merchandise from the top floor to the basement. Just a couple of months later, the cracks multiplied dramatically. The management's response was to close the top floors. They invited civil engineers to inspect the building, who quickly came to the conclusion that the building was at risk of collapse. The director suggested to Lee Jun that the building be evacuated, but Lee angrily rejected the idea, saying he didn't want to lose revenue. It was very much one rule for them, though, as Lee was more than happy to evacuate himself alongside the other executives. Do you know who was working in the building at the time? His daughter-in-law. He didn't even tell her. At 5 p.m. on the June 29, 1995, the 5th floor ceiling began to sink. Still, Lee did not close the store or order any emergency repairs. Nearly an hour later, audible cracking sounds filled the building, prompting staff to sound the alarms and evacuate the customers. However, it was too late. The roof collapsed and the air conditioning behemoths dropped through it, smashing through each and every floor. The main columns buckled and within less than 20 seconds, the south wing of the building came crashing down, killing over 500 people and injuring over 900 more. It took a days-long rescue effort to free the trapped survivors, some of whom surviving the contemporaneous hot weather by drinking rainwater. By contrast, some of the trapped victims survived the collapse but drowned to death because of the water used to suppress the fire. The collapse was investigated by one Professor Chung, a civil engineering professor. During his interrogation of Lee, the latter disregarded the victims and stated his primary concern was the financial damage suffered by his company. He was ultimately arrested, convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He only served 7 but died shortly after release anyway. Lee Jun turned ruthlessness into an art form. He was utterly selfish and devoid of humanity. It's an incredibly rare time when I say this of anyone, but I'm glad that waste of air is dead. The man that comes to mind is James Brock. He was a hotelier. When Martin Luther King Jr. came to have his lunch at the Monson Motor Lodge in St. Augustine, Florida, he was turned down, arrested and jailed for trespassing. The property he stepped in was meant for the whites. While in prison, Luther wrote a letter to a religious leader, Rabbi Israel Dresner, who gathered his men for a protest. The protest was heated and the owner went bananas. When some of the protesters jumped into the motel's swimming pool, James Brock decided to take the matters into his own hands by pouring a gallon of hydrochloric acid into the swimming pool to burn their skin. The incident led to the introduction of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which disallowed discrimination on the basis of religion, race, color, sex, or national origin. Outside of organized crime, few businessmen could keep pace with Rockefeller when it came to ruthlessness. How he came to be such a miserable excuse for a human being is complex. Perhaps it starts with having a notorious father, William Rockefeller, who was at one point literally a snake oil salesman. Or perhaps it was angst over his father's bigamy or having to relocate as a teenager to avoid dad's indictment on rape charges. However he came to be the quintessential Scrooge character, He played the part with a thoroughness that Dickens would have appreciated had Rockefeller been fictional. In spite of being the second wealthiest man in history, he famously lived well beneath his means and kept handwritten ledgers of personal expenses up until his death. In business, he was as relentless toward competition as he was toward his own happiness. Rockefeller is quoted as once saying, "Competition is sin." He certainly did his best to eliminate this particular sin. This is the man that created the modern concept of monopoly. In United States law still bears marks from the battle to disassemble his creation, Standard Oil. He was most famous for the dirty tactic of making secret deals with the railroads that allowed Standard to ship its product at a lower effective rate than his takeover targets. But there is virtually no underhanded device that Rockefeller did not employ in the service of crushing the sin of competition. Standard would go so far as to buy all of the local barrels so as to prevent competitors from being able to store their product. And when all else failed, Standard would price oil as low as necessary to drive the smaller refiners out of business or coerce them into agreeing to be purchased by Rockefeller. Many modern biographers often have a more moderate take on Rockefeller. Late in life, he had his own Scrooge-like conversion as he tried to escape his sobriquet of the most hated man in America through philanthropy. But it is hard to forget the serious young businessman who found competition sinful and was willing to use bribery and coercion to build his empire. Hopefully, somewhere between his profligate crushing of competition and his conversion to the endower of universities and hospitals, he found what he needed to rest in peace. Bill Gates is a well-known humanitarian and philanthropist. How could he be a ruthless businessman? Have you heard of digital research? Well, if you have not, that's because they were destroyed using not exactly legal practices, like planting code in Windows 3.1 that threw errors on DOS. But that's just one of extreme examples that came out to light thanks to subsequent lawsuits that took years or even decades. During 90s, Microsoft disposed of 4 out of 10 largest software companies. DR mentioned above was largest operating system company, Lotus was leading spreadsheets, and Word perfect text processor market, and each of them was larger than Microsoft at the time. Yet somehow all of them failed to adopt their DOS products to Windows. That was back with Windows 3, that run on top of DOS. There was also Windows NT, based not on DOS, but on VMS kernel, SGI graphics, HPFS file system, and so on. Wait, what's a VMS, says you? Digital Equipment Corporation was the leading manufacturer of mini computers, like one that didn't have a microprocessor, but 3 chips for CPU. And operating systems for these. Microsoft bought their kernel developer lead, who came over with DEC kernel source, allegedly. The lawsuit ended up with settlement that allowed DEC to run Windows on their 64-bit microcomputers for a decade or so, and Microsoft to keep their kernel developer and his knowledge. SGI stands for Silicon Graphics, who made the best graphics workstations at the time. They sold OpenGL to Microsoft, nowadays known as Direct3D. HPFS is IBM file system developed for their OS/2, nowadays shipped with Windows as NTFS. Oh, and OS/2 was IBM competing operating system, co-developed by Microsoft. Now these are just the largest companies and products that disappeared from history thanks to Bill Gates. Not exclusively, of course, but in good part. Many other smaller ones simply got purchased and shut down. Nothing could stand in the way. Eventually these toxic business practices led to United States v. Microsoft Corporation antitrust case, as Microsoft attempted to own the web. In the process, or as the result, Bill Gates left the company. Under new management, Microsoft became more or less big company as any other. But worry not, Bill Gates moved on, into healthcare. So COVID-19 pandemic hits, and everybody seems to agree there has to be a vaccine available in public domain, one that everyone can make, or millions are going to die. Worry not, Gates Foundation donates $1 billion or so, and convinces Oxford to sell the rights to AstraZeneca instead. Poor countries can't afford to buy vaccines, aren't allowed to make them, millions die a horrible death. The position of Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is crystal clear: waiving intellectual property is not way forward. No matter what. Edit: I don't usually disable comments, but I really have no intention of discussing Gates or COVID, or fueling any related conspiracy theories. So deleted and disabled. Thanks for understanding. Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future also. Don't forget to like and subscribe to you never miss a video.